Growing up, it wasn't an issue that I really thought about, to be honest. It probably wasn't until I was in medical school, actually, that I actually started to think about it. I don't have any traumatic shower, locker room stories or any of those type of events that ever brought the subject of circumcision up, right? But in second year medical school, it was part of our urology rotation, and although the practice of circumcision wasn't being done in the hospital, there was outpatient clinics outside of the hospital that we were encouraged to go and just to learn the mechanics behind the surgery. And I remember one of the older urologists was a Scottish man, a country that doesn't really practice circumcision. And I remember sitting there at lunch with him, and we were talking about this circumcision clinic, and he said, well, if a boy didn't clean behind his ears, we wouldn't cut his ears off. And he was very, very critical of it. And it's the first time I've ever kind of heard anyone like vocally speak out against it. And it did make me pause for a second and actually start to think about it. And although I've never raised a scalpel and participated in it, I have observed the surgeries as a medical student, and it was pretty easy for me to realize that's something that I shouldn't do, that I probably won't be able to do, and have no place to be doing. It became very clear cut to me that it was a problem, an ethical problem, what was going on. So myself and a significant number of other members in my clinic group just refused to participate in that outpatient clinic, and that was actually relatively easy to do in my medical school. There was never this was something that was optional. That was if people wanted to learn this additional skill, they could do it, but it wasn't part of the core curriculum. But we made a point out of conscientiously refusing to participate in that particular clinic because it didn't seem right, and I didn't have the knowledge at the time, or I didn't have the ability to articulate why I thought that we shouldn't be doing that. But it just struck me as something that we shouldn't be doing. That was 18, 19 years ago, and it made such an impression on me, though. I do remember sort of always looking through the news and the medical literature for that reason of why we're doing it. It's got to be out there. It's going to come up and it's going to make sense. And there's going to be a study that shows that this is why we're doing this. And in 18 years, I just never saw that convincing piece of evidence to say this is why we're doing it. And that made me think, how can we be doing something that just has no good reason for it, right? We just don't understand why we're doing this, and we don't have a solid reason for doing this. So it was over time. I think it was a gradual process for me to start to develop what was initially just an instinctive guess that this is wrong, to a more intellectual, organized way of thinking about it that confirmed for me why it was wrong, and why it was wrong on so many levels. So I think that takes a long time to understand all of the factors, because it is a very complex issue. And certainly when I had my own children, when I became more clarified about my religious views, there's a number of factors that sort of came into play that took what was initially a bit of indifference and turned it into a very, very strong opposition to the practice. It started to bother me on different levels that it never did initially. Just looking at something and thinking, this is not right. I don't know why, but it doesn't feel right. I can now understand the different levels why it bothers me. I can understand the different ways in which it bothers me. It bothers me. First of all, it bothers me as a physician, right? This is my profession's problem. We were the first profession to take what was a religious ritual and to turn it into a medical practice. We packaged it and we sold it to the population, and it was based on pseudoscience and superstition and irrational fears of cleanliness and all of the wrong reasons to promote a surgery. And after doctors delivered this to the public, then we didn't have the intellectual and scientific courage to correct ourselves. And I think, most people would agree that the most powerful aspect of science is it is self-correcting. Bad evidence is constantly corrected by better evidence, by good evidence. And the solution to bad evidence is not some magic ritual. The solution to bad evidence is better research and better work. And circumcision got a free ride, right? It wasn't good for fixing problem A. Maybe it's good for fixing problem B. Or let's use problem C as the reason why we keep doing it. So it carried through, and we just, for some reason, we're not able to say we were wrong with why we implemented this practice into our medical practice. And certainly over the years, the excuses have been much more complex and much more scientifically complex. The issues are presented with a different type of urgency, I would say now. The HIV would be the classic example. This is a life-saving indication now why circumcision is needed, whereas previously it may have just been for behavioral factors. Children weren't behaving properly, so the stakes are up. But at no point do the majority of physicians stop and say, based on all of our science and all of the hard work and progress in medical science, what are the chances that this ritual from the Bronze Age is beneficial for anything? What are the odds that it's truly the cure or the prevention for all these serious diseases? It certainly hasn't been investigated with the rigor that other medical interventions would be, right? So yeah, it offends me as a doctor, and it's a bit embarrassing that more physicians don't see the weakness behind using this as a therapy. It offends me as an intact man. Every time that you have to read a study or listen to parents say that they circumcise their child for hygiene reasons, for reasons of cleanliness, to think that there's, first of all, that there's something dirty to begin with a natural body part, but that men are somehow not sophisticated enough to know how to clean our own bodies, that we don't know how to care for, we don't know basic hygiene actually to clean ourselves is kind of insulting, right? So yeah, it offends me on a few different levels. It bothers me from a religious and philosophical point of view as well. I don't think that the creator of the universe specifically wants us to cut off part of the genitals of just the males of our species. I think that is a obviously man-made proposition, and it shows on so many levels. It has the cruelty and the aggression and the typical type of trauma that you would expect from our species some of the time. We can do horrible, cruel things, and this is an example of one of those things. And I don't think it's divinely mandated, and it offends me when that's the basis of some people's argument about why it should continue. And certainly, even if I'm wrong and it is divinely mandated, it should not be the reason why a parent decides to do it to another person. The parent should only be allowed to do it to themselves if that's what they believe. So, yeah, it bothers me on multiple different levels. There was not one particular event that said now is the time when I have to say something. And I think a lot of people that are interested in this topic and are motivated to stop circumcision, I think a lot of us, it's the same. It's a number of cumulative events. There comes a time when you have examined the issue on so many levels and seen the convergence of so many reasons why it shouldn't be done, that it becomes very hard not to speak out against it. And it's similar to any kind of human rights violation that it is so blatantly obvious that it starts to bother you why other people can't appreciate it the same way that you can. It's just circumcision is one of those things. To me, it's just so obviously wrong. It's just so patently, obviously wrong, and it does bother me when other people can't see it. The other thing too is there's obviously ignorance towards it, but there doesn't seem to be, because it's a taboo subject, the only time it ever really comes up, I think, is as the subject of a joke. And I think that's because people are so uncomfortable around it. It's really the only way to bring it up is as a joke. And the witnessing some of the ignorance around the issue and seeing it used as a light joke, I always think the same thing. You're laughing, but you should be crying, right? It's so obviously. I don't see the humor in the mutilation, the cutting of children's genitals, and it's one of those things that people really don't think about when they think that's a fair subject for humor, right? So there's a number of things that sort of were just seething under the surface that just started to build, and eventually I felt obligated to start speaking out against it. Quite honestly, too, I think that the topic it's fascinating. It's fascinating and it's terrifying at the same time, and it's sad, but it has so many different perspectives that it's an interesting topic. And I find that if you can broach the topic in an academic, relatively intellectual conversation with people, that other people also find it interesting, and because they're able to talk about it in an intellectual way, it drops a lot of the emotional guards that's around it, and it allows people to analyze it a little bit more objectively, in an analytical form. And I think that helps people really. That's the first step that people need to do, is to sort of drop some of the emotional protective baggage around the issue and address it from a little bit more of a scientific perspective. It has a lot of the perfect factors for a self-replicating memeplex, basically a social phenomenon that just will replicate itself. In this particular social phenomenon, I'd say it's a very pernicious one. I don't think anyone forced people to sing happy birthday every time it was your birthday, but that's a self-replicating social phenomenon that probably is not harmful, right? But circumcision is an example of something that just replicates itself. I think one of the key factors is that there's a lot of silence and shame and secrecy that go along with this. People don't like. It's certainly not polite conversation over coffee with your friends or your neighbors. I don't think there's very much discourse even in families. I don't think that the males look to the generation above them and say, "Why did you do this to me?" I don't think that they look to the generation below them and say, "This is why I did it to you, son." So there's very little discussion about why it continues in families and cultures and religions and society. I think there's an enormous amount of anthropological theories about why it started and why it persists. It's obviously a very powerful display of social cohesion and in-group belonging, if you're willing to perform something so traumatic on your child, especially in the days when circumcision was very dangerous, in the Bronze Age and prehistoric days, when if it was done incorrectly, or if you were unlucky and you developed an infection, it could lead to the death of your child. So I think it's a very powerful emotional way to